Well, great. Well, thank you for having me today. I've really enjoyed hearing some of the presentations. I had a chance to listen in on Ms. Shepard's talk yesterday, and we have a very similar experience because we both have published with the History Press, and she had a talk on writing nonfiction history. So I'm going to try to do a little different talk. You can see kind of from the agenda, if you go to the next slide, please, should be an agenda for today's conversation. And I'm really going to start out just by talking about local history or Virginia history. I teach at John Tyler Community College. I teach U.S. history and Western civilization. And my first lecture, I really tried to get the students interested in history and and specifically the location and how fortunate we are as Virginians, as living in Virginia, to be surrounded by not only Virginia history but also United States history. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time of kind of talking about local history. I also worked at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture for about 12 years. So we were the State History Museum. We are the State History Museum. So it's great to be surrounded by those archives and museum artifacts. So just have a little discussion on Virginia is for history lovers. And then I'll move into talking about my experience working on a book called German Sailors in Hampton Roads, a World War I story at the Norfolk Navy Yard. I'm not from Hampton Roads, but I think I was allowed to participate in this because of the content of my first book. So I'll be talking about that process, how you can try to find a great story. I think Ms. Shepard also talked about this as well. You want to publish a book that non-history people will want to read. And I think that was a really important point that she made. So I'll talk a little bit about finding a great story, just get into a little bit of the research process, the writing and editing process, and then of course marketing, because the book's not going to sell itself. So I'll just kind of go over that, and then we'll move into just a short discussion on my current book project with UVA Press on the history of Virginia cider, colonial America's beverage of choice. So I'll talk a little bit about that and how I got involved in that topic as well. And then we'll finish up and have some Q&A. So that looks like the agenda for today. And I think this is great. When I worked at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, it was formerly called the Virginia Historical Society. We really started to use this slogan. Of course, everyone's familiar with the great slogan, Virginia is for lovers, that was introduced in, I believe, the late 60s. And so I really try to tell my students at Tyler that Virginia is for history lovers, and history is all around us. And when we talk about the first, when we start our introductory lecture and talk about Jamestown, you can go to the next slide, the first permanent English settlement. Most of my students have been there. That's a pretty much a staple for fourth grade field trips. My wife is a fourth grade teacher in Chesterfield County. She goes there every year to Jamestown. And I can really spark the students' interest because they're like, oh yeah, we went there. And we can have that conversation about how it's the first permanent English settlement, but then we can go on to talk about how it's relevant today. Last year, in 2019, with the commemoration of the landing of the first Africans. So we have that discussion of what it means to them, what that event in 1619 means to them. So I really just try to kind of hit home and draw connections with the local history. John Tyler is a very diverse institution, so it's great to discuss topics like that, things that they may not have covered in grade school. And I teach at the Chester campus, so you can go to the next slide. Again, just kind of talking about local history right now before we get into the research and writing process and coming up with stories. But I pull up this map that shows the Capitol Trail Some of you may have been on the Capitol Trail. It's a great bike route. And I tell my students at the Chester campus, if you go down Route 10, go east through Hopewell and cross over the Benjamin Harrison Bridge, then you're going to pass by several historical sites. If you get on Route 5 and go towards Williamsburg, you'll see William Henry Harrison's birthplace at Berkeley. They have another claim to fame. They have a few claims to fame, but you could also talk a little bit about how they argue that they're the site of the first Thanksgiving in 1619, when 38 English settlers arrived at Berkeley and they observed a day of Thanksgiving to God. So a lot of students kind of start that conversation. You can go 5 miles, 8 miles down the road, and you hit these historic sites. Also, if you continue on that route to Williamsburg, you'll hit Sherwood Forest, John Tyler's home, who the college was named after. And of course, the Virginia tourism has capitalized on that piece of history with the beautiful bike trail that exists. I then continue to go on to talk about sites in Richmond and Petersburg. I go to eat in Richmond a lot. I live in Chester, but we definitely go to Richmond a lot. And I can explain to them that if you're just walking through Jackson Ward in Richmond, this historically African-American, very vibrant neighborhood that has a ton of history. It was once called the Harlem of the South. I'm just saying, if you can walking through that neighborhood, maybe you're going to dinner and you can pass by a Maggie Walker historical site or a statue of Bill Bojangles Robinson. And so these very diverse, this tells this diverse history of Virginia, of local history. Maggie Walker, the first African-American woman to charter and become the president of a bank in the United States. So very remarkable. And Bill Bojangles Robinson, one of the greatest entertainers of that era, who performed in vaudeville and also went on to perform in movies, to act in movies with people like Shirley Temple. And then just continuing on, if you go to the next slide of Petersburg, Chester is also very close to Petersburg, so I always point out the rich and diverse history there as well. When I was in graduate school at Virginia State University, I had the opportunity to work with Howard Ball, who was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. I did a series of oral history interviews and just learned a lot about how he was able to overcome the racism at home during that time period in the 1940s and even right after World War II when he came back, and just that fight against racism at home. And also that fight against fascism abroad as he flew missions during World War II. He went on to fly over 130 missions. So I kind of just point out again that history is all around us. Virginia is for history lovers. There's something for everyone. And there's a story there's stories that need to be told. There's stories that need to be told. And that's what I'll get to in a minute in terms of publishing. Just kind of a final piece of this Virginia is for history lovers. If you go to the next slide, it should be Pamplin Historical Park. I worked at Pamplin Historical Park during graduate school. It's a Civil War battlefield and museum in Petersburg, Virginia, a site where the Union soldiers broke through the Confederate lines on April 2nd, 1865. And that was really my first job in public history. I was an educator and tour guide, and I just loved telling those stories about civilians and soldiers and their time during that very difficult period of history. And I still take my students, some of my students, back to Pamplin Historical Park, especially our history club as well. And after Pamplin Historical Park, you can go to the next slide. I went on to work at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, where I spent 12 years working there as an assistant editor in their publications department, and also a manager of digital resources as well. And I was just inundated with these wonderful artifacts, these wonderful manuscripts that tell Virginia's history. And these things included items like letters from Thomas Jefferson, George Washington's diary. Uh, uh, they even had Douglas Wilder's cowboy boots when he was governor. So just a very diverse collection. And I was able to use our website and also video production to tell these stories. If you go to the next slide, it shows that there's a permanent exhibit called The Story of Virginia. That's what you can see here. So hopefully, if you have an opportunity, make sure you make the trip to Richmond to check out that museum. One more slide ahead. Yeah, and this is another thing that I tell my students. Um, we look at these collections in archives. For example, this is some drawings from Private Robert Knox Sneeden. He was in the Union Army, and during the Civil War, he traveled through Virginia, and he documented his time. And so he documented the Monitor and the Merrimack. There's several sketches that he made, and we produced a video on the Battle of the Ironclads that targeted fourth grade audiences for their Virginia Studies SOL. So it's just ways that you can use um, artifacts to tell stories. It doesn't have to be for necessarily for a book. It could be to make a video for younger audiences. So that's kind of just an overview. If we go to the next slide, we'll get into the actual my experience working on my first book. And at the Virginia Historical Society, that's where it all started. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture. That's where this idea started for a book about German sailors in Hampton Roads. This is when I was able to give a lecture at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture on the book. So that was kind of a really nice opportunity for me to go back and present at my former place of employment on that topic. All right, so let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and we'll get into actually talking about my experience working on this book with the History Press. And again, if you attended Ms. Shepard's presentation, a lot of this may overlap because, again, we worked with the same publisher and both published books dealing with Hampton Roads. And if we go to the next slide, perfect. So if we look at kind of this process of publishing nonfiction history, of publishing local history books, you've got to find a good topic, or you really need to try to find something that makes a good story. And this idea that I want my non-history friends to want to read it. I have a lot of friends that say, "Oh, we're the history nerds." Well, that's correct, but history can be exciting and fun as well, and it can make a good read. So you need to find a really good topic. And I'm going to tell you how I came across this topic of German sailors in Hampton Roads. I'm just going to read from the preface of my book here, German Sailors in Hampton Roads. So I have a couple excerpts that I read. So I worked at the Virginia Historical Society, a research library and museum located in Richmond, Virginia for 12 years. And from 2008 to 2011, I served as an assistant editor for its scholarly journal and members newsletter. One of my favorite jobs was not fact-checking the articles or indexing an issue of the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, as much fun as that sounds. It was finding a mystery photograph for the newsletter. And we had this newsletter, History Notes, and one of my jobs as the assistant editor for publications was to find a mystery photo to post on the back of this newsletter. And our members would send in their guesses and try to discover what it was. And my job was to pick a photo that would stump our readers. And so one day I was searching through the postcard collection, trying to find something that would stump our readers, and I came across an image of jovial German sailors on board a ship in Hampton Roads. As you can see, this is the postcard on the screen that I came across when I was doing this research. And I was excited, and I thought I had found an image to fool our readers. So my next test was to check with the curator of prints and photographs. If I could stump him, then I could fool our readers. And so I proudly entered his office and asked him to identify the scene. And he quickly responded, well, that's the German sailors who built the tiny village in Hampton Roads during World War I. But that was all he could tell me. I was initially disappointed that I couldn't use the photo for the mystery photo challenge, but I was intrigued at the story and I wanted to know more. So that's how I found out this kind of initial, um, that's how I got interested in the story. I wanted to know more. And then this led me down this path of research at the National Archives, the Library of Virginia, and various other archives throughout the United States to really try to get this story together. And all of these resources provided the evidence to tell this unique and perplexing story of 800 German sailors' internment in Virginia, in a Virginia maritime community during World War One. So that's really, I think it's like a pretty neat story of how I became interested in the topic. You just kind of stumble across something that piques your interest. And so then that gives you an idea of how I came up with this topic. If we go to the next slide, in this section, I'm just kind of give you an overview of the story. Again, if you want all the information, go ahead and purchase the book. But I'll just give you a little overview of the German sailors in Hampton Roads and what they're all about, and then I'll talk about really how I kind of got into that research and talk about the writing and editing process along with marketing. So when we look at this story of German sailors in Hampton Roads, there, the book is really about the relationship that these 800 German sailors formed with the local community in Hampton Roads. Again, there were these two ships, the Crown Prince Wilhelm and the Prince Eitel Friedrich. If you go to the next slide, you'll see the other ship. And these two ships were German surface raiders. So their job during World War I, this is before the United States enters the war, their job during World War I was to sink Allied merchant ships. That's what they did. They went through the waters and they destroyed basically anything that the enemy was trading. So that's what they did. And eventually they made it to the Hampton Roads area, and they were running low on fuel and supplies. They were being pursued by French and British ships, and they sought refuge in a neutral port in Hampton Roads. And they eventually came into Newport News first. They came into Newport News, and they were given a certain amount of time to get fuel and repairs, and then go back to sea, because you couldn't wage war out of a neutral's port. So they kept saying, "Oh, we're going to go back out. We're going to go back out," but they really couldn't. Their ships were battered, and they would have likely been destroyed by the lurking French and British ships. So they ended up being interned at the Norfolk Navy Yard in Portsmouth. So these ships were moved to the Norfolk Navy Yard in Portsmouth, along with the 800 German sailors. And then they become these kind of pseudo prisoners of war, because again, the United States isn't at war against Germany at this point. And so it's a very unique experience for these German sailors and the local Norfolk and Portsmouth community, because the German sailors weren't seen as enemies. They were really seen as friends to the local community. The German sailors went to baseball games in Norfolk, in Portsmouth. They went to parties. They went to church services. So they were really hanging out a lot with the local community. And that's what the book is really about. It's really about these relationships that formed. And one of the things that, if folks have heard about the story of the German sailors in Hampton Roads, one of the things they usually have heard about is a tiny village that the German sailors made. If you go to the next slide, perfect. Well, that's good. That just shows you some more of the interactions with the local community, the German sailors in the local community. If we get in the next slide, maybe. Perfect. Um, so I'm going to read an excerpt from my book that talks about this tiny German village that the sailors built at the Norfolk Navy Yard in Portsmouth. The sailors were given this large amount of unused space at the Navy Yard there, and they end up building this village kind of to pass the time, right? They're bored, so they need something to do, but to also kind of help remind them of their home country. But it becomes a major tourist destination. People from all over the United States come there. Some very prominent citizens as well. So I'm just going to read an excerpt about the village. The quaint structures included a church, a newspaper office, telegraph station, postmaster station, fire department, police station, gymnasium, bowling alleys, marriage license bureau, and several other little German villas. The cottages were decorated with sunflower and hollyhock gardens, red roofs, white curtains, and carvings along the eaves and fence posts. They were named after the German ships, including the Emden, the Karlsruhe, and the Lux. These are actually ships where many of the sailors came from before they boarded the Prince Idol and also the Crown Prince. More than 1,000 people toured the small replica village one day in 1916. Tourists flocked to experience German culture and craftsmanship. The visitors walked through the streets labeled with German names and viewed the many attractions. The sailors charged 10 cents for entry. They performed acrobatic shows, they sang songs, and gave concerts. One guest remarked on the spectacle of the community, calling it an atmosphere of Kaiser and culture, and Wiener Schnitzel, and good sturdy Lutheranism, and everything one could find in an honest, hardworking German town of the old country. The sailors could not go home, so they built their home at the Norfolk Navy Yard. And it goes on to describe in more detail about this village, and that it passes that time of boredom, but also really becomes this major tourist destination. The local chamber of commerce in Norfolk and Portsmouth, they were very interested in keeping these German sailors there because they were bringing in a lot of money. If people came to Norfolk and Portsmouth for business meetings, one of the first places they went to visit, for leisure, was the Norfolk Navy Yard to see the German sailors. So it was really great for the local community. There were obviously issues with having 800 German sailors at the Norfolk Navy Yard. One chapter in my book talks about escapes. So that was always a problem for US officials. And again, the big part about the book is one of the main themes is the relationships. But it's not just the relationships between the sailors and the local community, it's also the relationship between the German officers and also the US officers, particularly the commandants of the Norfolk Navy Yard. Okay, well, just want to make this clear before we get to this relationship piece that when the United States enters the war against Germany, these German sailors are no longer buddies with the local citizens. They're shipped down to POW camps in Georgia, so they officially become prisoners of war. Their ships, the two German ships, if you go to the next slide, will be turned into troop transport ships for the United States. So those would become United States ships. They'd be taken over. And again, we see that these kind of jovial German sailors are now enemies. But some of the German sailors had such a great time in Norfolk that they applied to stay in the United States. So about, I have to check the exact numbers in the book, but I believe about 70 of the German sailors ended up staying in the United States because they had such a great experience. If you go to the next slide, please. Perfect. And as I mentioned, these relationships were really what really sparked my interest in the story. In these images on the screen, the one on the left is a German officer, Count Alfred von Niezikowski. He was a Polish count on board one of the German surface raiders, and he became very close to the commandant of the Norfolk Navy Yard, Walter McLean, which you can see here. So we have a German officer and then a U.S. officer here, and they became very, very close. And I'm going to read just an excerpt from this relationship. Count Alfred von Niesiekowski was one of the men permitted to stay in the United States. The former German naval officer from the Crown Prince became a U.S. citizen in January of 1926, so well after the war. And he married Miss Nadine Altman of Baltimore in 1927. And Niesiekowski's choice for his best man at his wedding may have surprised many because of the past strain on German-American relations since U.S. entry into World War I. But to those who knew about the internment of those sailors at the Norfolk Navy Yard, it may not have been such a shock. His best man was retired U.S. Navy officer Rear Admiral Walter McLean, who had watched Niesiekowski and the rest of the 800 German sailors from the two interned ships. So pretty kind of remarkable story there. You have the U.S. official, McLean, who's the commandant of the Norfolk Navy Yard. He's responsible for watching these German sailors, making sure they are falling in line with what they're supposed to do. And then you have one of the German officers who ends up staying in the United States, becoming a U.S. citizen, and at his wedding, his best man is the commandant. So I just kind of end this little discussion of the book with that piece. So hopefully that's piqued your interest, and you can go and buy a copy of German Sailors. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the research process, the writing and editing process, and then a little bit of the marketing. So the research, I love doing research. Again, I've worked in public history for over 12 years. That's one of the things I like to do. And I found a gold mine of artifacts, of manuscripts, of correspondence at the National Archives. So they had basically all of the correspondence from the German officers to the U.S. officials. If we go to the next slide, this is an example of one of the things that was included in the correspondence. As I mentioned, there was a big issue with escapes during their time of internment. And this is a letter from one of the German captains, and it's to one of the other commandants, and it's talking about one of the German sailors who supposedly escaped, Thierry, and it's a description of the escapee, and also what the captain has drawn here is his tattoo that he has on his right arm. So he's basically kind of working with the commandant and giving him all the information that he needs to try to apprehend Thierry. So this is kind of interesting piece of correspondence. If you go to the next slide, again, there's all this official correspondence going on between the German officers and also the U.S. officials. And then kind of every so often, I'd run across a receipt. And that receipt was for kegs of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. These are German sailors. And obviously, Germany is known for their beer. And so these sailors wanted some beer during their time of internment. And so I thought that was unique that this receipt would come up in the National Archives every so often for those German sailors. But it was a wonderful collection at the National Archives. When I went there, I spent a couple of days there, and I took my camera, this is a while ago, and was able to take digital photos of all of the pieces of correspondence. And then, I came back and at my house and kind of sifted through all of that. Now a bunch of it has been digitized, so that would have been great if that had happened while I was there. But when you're doing research, you just gonna have to take your time. It's a very lengthy process, and now many of the archives libraries allow you to bring your phone to take pictures. So definitely take advantage of that. If we want to go to the next slide. So I used, the big part of my research was the National Archives. I mean, uh, 800 pieces of correspondence. I don't know the exact numbers, but a massive amount of correspondence. So that's what I really used as, the facts for the book. But I also used, I wanted to use a newspaper too. And so I used the Virginia Pilot and the Norfolk Landmark. And what that showed was kind of what the local community thought of these German sailors. And there was really a daily update of the local community's interactions with these German sailors, and how they viewed them. So went to the Library of Virginia, where I went through the microfilm of that newspaper. It was really nice to have those kind of two pieces, the newspaper and then also the correspondence, that kind of came together and formed that narrative. If we go to the next slide, it's just another example of the newspaper as well. And it was about 17 months of correspondence, and then also the newspaper that I went through to tell this story. And if we go to the next slide, great. Another part of the book, and with the history press especially, if you're looking at local history publication, the history press is really interested in photographs, and illustrations. So it's a great way to add that extra element to a history book. And I was very fortunate to have, there was a large availability of postcards of these German sailors. The German sailors sold postcards when people came to visit their village. So they sold postcards. So there's lots of postcards that are out there at various archives. I think I've listed some of those on the agenda, but the Portsmouth Naval History, the Portsmouth Navy Yard Museum, the Hampton Roads Naval Museum, also the Sergeant Memorial Library at Slover was very, very helpful. And they have a good collection of photographs and postcards. So we'll go to the next slide. And the next slide, the Library of Congress as well had some images that I used for the book. Yeah, and I was also able to make some good contacts. I think this is the next part of the research piece. It's when you're doing local history and history books, it's important to make some great contacts. I think Ms. Shepard mentioned this as well. One of the great contacts that I made was with Marcus Robbins, who was the historian for the Norfolk Navy Yard. And I really had no idea about the Norfolk Navy Yard, any really history about it. And I would go to Portsmouth and meet with Marcus, and he would really show me things like this, like a blueprint of the Navy Yard at this time period in 1915, and show me where the sailors were. And we would even take the little ferry boat from Portsmouth over to Norfolk, and look back, and kind of he'd show me where the village was. And so it's great to have that expert there, because I was not an expert of the Norfolk Navy Yard at all. So I highly recommend making contacts. If you ever get help with anything, you want to send a thank you card, and it's just great to maintain that relationship with people. You know, Peggy McPhillips at Slover, Troy Velos as well at the library, Diane Cripps. I'd help with Clay Farrington at the Hampton Roads Naval Museum. So there's just a lot of folks to make contacts with. One of the more interesting trips that I had was to the Naval Hospital, the Norfolk Naval Hospital, because two of the German sailors were buried at that naval hospital. And I was able to get a special tour of the naval hospital, and with Alan Cutchin, one of the volunteers there, and it was just remarkable. Not a lot of people get to do that. So yeah, you'll if you're gonna embark on this adventure, you'll get to do all these wonderful things by making contacts. The next slide, please. And the archives weren't just in Virginia. I traveled to Pennsylvania. I would contact some other archives in the United States, but I made one trip to the German Society of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia because they had a copy of the German sailors' newspaper when they were interned at the Norfolk Navy Yard. The German sailors published their own newspaper, the Colony Anzeiger, and so I was able to go there and get to see a copy of this newspaper. The Portsmouth Navy Yard Museum also had a copy as well. So it's, as I mentioned, it's a great adventure. So next slide, please. Okay, so the writing and editing process. The, I had a unique experience because this story was actually a thesis for me for my graduate work, and I needed to turn this thesis into a narrative, into something that people would want to purchase and read. And so after I finished my thesis, I started giving presentations and lectures. I made like a nice little 45-minute presentation. It was a great story, and people started telling me, this is a great story. You need to look at having it published. And so that's really pushed me into searching out for a publisher to work with. I looked at that narrative, turned it into, looked at that thesis, turned it into a story that I did presentations, and then I was able to get a contract with the History Press. And then I was fortunate to have a great editor, so that was something that helped me out a lot. My former boss at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture agreed to be my editor. So what we would do is I would work on a chapter, then I would send it to him. He would make his edits, and we would meet over lunch and go over those edits. So that was very nice. Not a lot of folks are that fortunate to have a really good editor. When you're working with the press, as we heard from a earlier presentation yesterday, when you work with the History Press, you have an acquisitions editor who's kind of your go-between, and then you also will have other editors as well. With the History Press, had an acquisitions editor and a production editor to kind of go through my chapters, right? To go through my manuscript, and they'll do some things that you may not agree with. One of the battles that I had with my editors was over the title. I wanted a really catchy title. My title that I wanted was The Kaiser's Courteous Pirates in Hampton Roads, because these sailors were very friendly when they took over a merchant ship. They would take the crew off of the merchant ship, and then they would place explosives on that ship and destroy it. So they never lost a life out at sea. So they were kind of known as the courteous pirates. They were taking over ships, but they weren't harming anyone. But the publisher said, well, they're not pirates because they're operating under the German flag. So I lost that battle, and I got this really general long title. But that's okay. So pick your battles with your editors and the publishers, and don't get discouraged. You continue to move forward. And another thing that was talked about yesterday is it's a long process. This is a really long process when you're working with the publisher, and it's just important to hang in there. Don't get discouraged. I have I had a 4-year-old son. My son's 6 now, so I think when I was doing it, he was probably 3 years old, and so it's really tough to have that full-time job with your family and you're working on this book on the side. But you just kind of have to carve out that time and just stay dedicated to that process. So with marketing, you finish the book, right? And now it's time to market your product. This is something that the History Press really pushes, and I'm sure lots of other presses push this as well. But they want something that sells, and so it's important to market your book. You're going to need to go do lectures and book signings. Try to find markets that are that would be interested in your book. Like I spent a lot of time in the Hampton Roads area. I already had those contacts at those museums and archives, so that was great to get to go back there and do book signings. So those are really important. My book was picked up in a few articles in the area as well. So that's kind of how you spread the news, spread the word. But one of the things I haven't really talked about is when you're trying to pitch your idea to the press, they ask you all these things. They ask you about, you know, how's your book going to sell? It's about German sailors. Well, is there a large German population in Hampton Roads? They try to think of every sort of angle that's available. And so that's something I didn't really think about when I was pitching the idea to the press. I was just thinking, this is a great story, so anyone should want to read it, but they want to know about certain demographics and that would be targeted with this information. Um, and again, I think that Miss Shepard went into great detail on this yesterday and did a fantastic job. So if you had a chance to listen to that, great. But if not, I highly recommend you go back and look at that. You can go to the next slide. So just kind of a few minutes here to wrap up on the next book project that I'm working on. Um, when I was at the Virginia Historical Society, I was part of a program called History on Tap. And if you go to the next slide, History on Tap was something where we took recipes from our collections and we partnered with a local brewery or cidery, and then they would reproduce that beverage. And one of the projects that we worked on was called the Complete Cider. So we took a recipe from, if you go to the next slide, we took a recipe from the Complete Housewife, and it was a cider recipe. And so we took this recipe to one of the cideries, Blue Bee Cider in Richmond, and said, "Hey, can you guys make this? And we'll have a special tasting. We'll bring in a historian to talk about colonial cider, and it'd be a great event." And it really worked out. It worked out perfectly. We had great attendance, and we did about 4 or 5 of these types of events. And so this is what really sparked my interest in the history of cider in Virginia and how it was really colonial Virginia's drink of choice. And you can also touch on aspects if we go to the next slide. So no, I only have a few minutes left. So that's our tasting that we had. But if we go to the next slide, one more. And the historian who talked at this tasting was Sarah Meacham from VCU, and she had published a book, Every Home a Distillery, and it talks about how women were the main makers of alcohol in colonial Virginia, also in Maryland, in the Chesapeake. And with this idea of Virginia cider, you can talk about things like this about how women played a major role in the production of cider. You can talk about how founding fathers like George Washington enjoyed cider. You talk about Thomas Jefferson, how he grew specific cider apples to produce cider. And there's all kind of different angles. Also, how slaves kind of were part of this cider production. And so that's really what I'm looking into right now. It's a very early process working with UVA Press. If we go to the next slide, and this will probably finish up. UVA Press has published a series of, of books. They're kind of like travel accounts. Um, Lee Graves, who's a beer historian, he did a book on Virginia beer, and this Virginia cider book is pretty much kind of that similar format. Where in Lee Graves's book, and also in this Virginia cider book, about the first third of the book will be the history of cider in Virginia. So you talk about some of those elements that I just mentioned, and then the remaining part of the book, if we go to maybe the last slide, that's fine if you can click ahead. And the remaining part of the book is really a look at the cideries in Virginia. There's 22 cideries currently in Virginia, and it will talk a lot about how these cideries are looking back to the past. So they're making ciders like Hugh's Crab, which was a Virginia apple that was kind of created in 1740s. That was one of the first instances of it, and it was made kind of a hybrid of a native crab apple of Virginia and also the domesticated apple of Europe. that formed. And so that, this cider's been made from that apple since the 1740s. And now cideries today are bringing that back. And so you can taste the same cider that they would have had in the 1740s. And so that's, I'll finish up there. I feel like I've kind of been rambling on here. But I wanted to just give you an overview of my experience working on local history projects, Virginia history projects. And as always, if you're interested in the book, please check it out. I also have a lecture that's available on the Virginia Museum of History and Culture's website that talks about the content of this book as well. So I'll stop there, and I think I have a couple minutes for a Q&A.
Yep, you have 2 questions. So Angela says, it's great that you had connection to an editor. I understand that publishing can be expensive for the publisher. Are there upfront costs that you as the author will have to absorb to get the book on shelves?
No. What the History Press, or for my experience, what the History Press did recommend, actually, this is very important, and I'm not sure, can't remember if this was discussed earlier. The History Press, they wanted me to buy a certain amount of books. I can't remember what the actual number was. It would have been like I spent $120 maybe in books, my own books. And then those are books that I went out and sold when I was at lectures and things like that and book signings. So they did want a commitment for me to purchase, again, I think it was like $120 to $150 in my own books from the beginning. And I was a little worried about that, but we've sold them all, which is great. So that was kind of an upfront cost. For me, they wanted some sort of commitment on that. Outside of that and upfront costs, I didn't have any. They didn't pay for any of my travel or anything like that for book signings um, or lectures or things like that, or any of the photo research. If I had to get rights or anything like that for the photos, that would come out of my pocket. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, and then Angela again says, a lot of people believe that they're good writers. How did you know that your style of writing would appeal to readers? Is there a particular style that you'd recommend to wannabe authors who aren't sure of how to get started in the actual process of getting down to writing?
Yeah, what I would recommend is finding, or if you have a friend, again, my kind of mentor was my former boss at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, and he had published extensively on Richmond and the Civil War. So I'd find someone that, if it's possible that you could learn from. That's really what I did, and he was my editor for the book as well. Um, I feel like I could tell a great story, but he really kind of helped me refine that and stay kind of focused on certain aspects. So I'd find someone that maybe could help you mentor and become a mentor or something like that and learn from them.
Angela says, thank you. That's a good tip. And if you haven't already, can you tell people where they can get your books?
Yeah, so it's available on Amazon, like everything, and you can also get it through the publisher at the History Press with Arcadia. So you can go to that website, but Amazon is usually one running the good specials.
All right. Thank you so much, Greg.
Okay, thank you.